Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. So, I've been asked to talk about the privacy paradox. Is there a privacy paradox, and are consumers willing to sacrifice their privacy for convenience? Today we have this big session on data protection because data protection has become a very important topic. But in Europe, in France, the first National Data Protection Act was voted and entered into application more than 40 years ago. And of course, during those 40 years, technology has evolved a lot. And also, data protection issues, data protection problems have also evolved a lot. So, the CNIL, which is the French Data Protection Authority, says that during those 40 years, it has lived 3 lives. So I don't know if 3 lives is the lucky number for the CNIL, but that's how it says. That's what it says. At first, back in 1978, only the government had databases and computers. So the first era was to protect individuals against the abuse of computers by the government. Then, in the 90s, that was the beginning of internet, and tech companies started to develop e-commerce. So that was the second era, and the CNIL had to protect consumers against the abuse by private companies. And nowadays, the CNIL says that we are in the third era, that the CNIL has to protect consumers, individuals, against themselves, because consumers seem to be giving their data everywhere. So this is why we say that there is a privacy paradox. So, what do consumers think about privacy, and how do consumers behave in real life? These are some examples of results of surveys that were made by Chinese associations and also in Europe. And it shows that consumers, when they are asked, they say that they are very concerned with privacy. So it shows that they are worried about technology and that technology would jeopardize their privacy. You see that the trust is very low. But now, what happens in real life? How do consumers behave in reality? Consumers say that they are worried about the protection of their personal data, but they give away their personal data on social media. They say that, you've seen that they trust social media, only 15% of them trust social media, but they spend their life on social media, and they give away their personal data, they disclose their intimacy. They even consider that privacy can be annoying when they are always interrupted by pop-ups asking them to consent. So, in fact, they don't want to be interrupted by pop-up ads, but they don't want to be interrupted by consent pop-ups either. They want convenience. They want to browse freely. That's what happens in real life. And they don't read the privacy notices either. That is also a problem. I mean, it's understandable, and it's also a problem that comes because of the regulation. When we look at the GDPR, for instance, Isabelle has been talking about this new European law that we have. If you look at the information requirements, it's 2 pages long. I mean, you have a list of 2 pages of the information notice that should be given to consumers, to individuals. So it's very understandable, in fact, that people do not want to read all those pages of information notice. They are looking, it's true, they are looking for convenience. Consumers say that they are afraid of hacking and data leaks, and it's true, they are afraid. We are all afraid of hacking and data leaks, but what happens in real life? They use simple passwords because it's very convenient. It's more convenient than having complex passwords. Some users, I would say perhaps the majority of the users, even use the same password on every site, everywhere. And of course, it increases the risk of data leaks, but they don't consider that they are to blame for that. So, yes, it seems there is a privacy paradox. However, having said that, having compared what consumers said and the reality, are really people wanting to give up their privacy for convenience, or is it just because, in fact, they have no other option? And when we look at what happens in our connected world, we see that people are forced to give up their privacy. To be able to install an app, they have to give up their data, their phone numbers, their contact list, their pictures, etc. They need to, if they want Wi-Fi, they want free Wi-Fi in a hotel, in an airport, everybody knows that. They need to provide personal data like their date of birth, the phone number. They must accept marketing communications. To be allowed to use a website, they need to consent to everything. If they want to rent a share bicycle, they are asked to register their phone number, their citizen ID card, their passport, all that just to rent a bicycle. So they are forced, in real life, in the digital world, they are forced to give up their privacy. And, of course, people cannot just stop. You know, it's not a real choice. They cannot stop using internet or being connected. They cannot stop using Baidu or Google. They cannot refuse to communicate through social media because that's the world nowadays. They cannot stop using their mobile phones. They cannot stop using app to pay their bills or to find a job, for instance. So, if they want the services, they have to use the technologies. And if the technologies ask them to provide their personal data, they will give it. They will give it to have the services. But they don't like it. They resent it. And that's the new trend. That's the new trend because consumers have evolved. They are not like they used to be 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. Now they have changed and they don't like the idea, they don't like the fact that they're giving away their personal data. So perhaps it's not really a privacy paradox. It's not so much of a paradox. It's rather like a disconnection, a disconnect between what companies are doing and the expectations of the individuals. And the fact that there is a lack of trust between individuals, between consumers and companies, when there is a lack of trust, then this is a risk. This can be a risk for companies because we are in an international world. The digital world is international. The digital world is a world of competition. So when we see that consumers resent the way they are being asked to disclose their privacy and their personal data, it means that it can be a risk for companies if they want to keep their customers in the future. Because this is an evolution, and this is not going to stop. So, what can be the solutions to solve the privacy paradox and also to build a bridge, let's say, between the expectations of individuals and what happens in real life. First of all, we need regulations. We need regulations because without laws to set the limits, there are no limits. And companies need to comply with law. I'm not going to go into all the details of the privacy principles. This is a summarized list of the privacy principles that are the basic of every data protection law, which are the basic of the GDPR, but not only of the GDPR. But there should be limits, and the limits should be clear, and they should be complied with. That's one thing. But the regulations should not overdo it. Because when regulations are too complex, then the companies cannot comply with the regulations. And as a lawyer, as a practitioner, my personal view is that the GDPR is a bit too complex and that companies cannot really comply with very complex rules. And in that case, that's a problem because it cannot bring trust. I mean, if companies do not comply, and when there is a law and companies cannot comply, that doesn't bring trust. So, but it's a question of law. We need regulations. It's also a question of transparency and communication, the right communication with the consumers. I took the example of the sanction against Google, which was the first big fine under the GDPR imposed by the CNIL in France in January of this year. Google was fined 50 million euros for lack of transparency. And because its privacy policy was not clear enough to consumers. I've put a summary here, but the important thing was that users could not understand the wording. They could not access the policy easily, so they did not have clarity. It took them up to 5 or 6 clicks to access to the relevant policy. Consent, they were asked for, in fact, consent was pre-ticked. And it was also a bundled consent because the users had to consent both to the terms of services and to the privacy policy in order to create an account. So that was considered as non-valid. There was no transparency, and consequently there was no valid consent. It was not a free, not a real consent, it was forced. So, because we have to conclude, and it's difficult to conclude, of course, on this difficult and complex issue, it's not only a question of law and complying with the law, it's also a question of building trust and finding the right approach with consumers. It needs, practice and privacy practices need to be user-friendly, otherwise consumers are not going to like it and are not going to trust. Since Jane is going to talk about privacy tools and technology, I focused on information notice and transparency. At Bird & Bird, we are a law firm, but we know that it's not all about law. It's not only legal. I mean, the problem and the solution is not only legal. If you have a privacy policy that can only be understood by lawyers, then you're not going to be trusted by customers. So you need to have the right content in the right place at the right time and using the right words. This is a challenge because companies need to comply with very complex regulations And at the same time, because otherwise they can be sanctioned, and at the same time, they need to be clear and they need to be understood by consumers. It's really a challenge. But clarity is required by law anyway, so they have to do it. Just a few words about the table that is here and that is in fact the key elements for a good privacy policy. It needs to be easily accessible in the right place, never more than 2 clicks away. It needs to take into account the consumer's path, the way the user is using the technology. It shouldn't be contradictory with the technology itself. And because information notices are usually very long because they need to comply with long regulations, a good thing is to have this detailed privacy policy, but also very short notice with the key information at entry point, so that the consumer can see a very short notice, so it has the key elements, it brings confidence, and if the consumers wants to see more, they can click and go to a longer information notice. The right content, it should not be a bundled consent, because in that case, it's not a free consent, it's not a take it or leave it consent, it's not a silent consent, it must be specific. Using simple words, because as I was saying, if you use complex words, nobody is going to understand, so it's useless. It shouldn't be confusing. And it means also, be careful with translations. I mean, we are always very, very careful with translations. A lot of misunderstanding come from the fact that it's only one policy that is just being translated literally, so that it doesn't take into account the culture and the understanding of consumers. So it has to be adapted. It has to be user-friendly. It has to be adapted to the local culture. So, in conclusion, let's say that if companies build up a privacy compliance organization and privacy compliant procedures, and if at the same time they make it user-friendly, I know it's difficult, but this is what is required, this can be a way to restore confidence by consumers in the companies, and to solve this privacy paradox and build a bridge between the expectations of consumers and what companies are doing. Thank you very much.